This is DGMT's Learning Lunch, and I'm your host, Rahima Esop. In some countries, England for instance, babies get free books. Well, their parents do, to encourage reading to young children from a young age. This is the goal of Book Start and similar book giveaway programs, and they're working. Research shows that programs like Book Start, for example, promote reading in the home, resulting in children with better literacy outcomes in preschool and beyond. So imagine what a program that puts free books in children's hands could do for South Africa, where 8 out of 10 grade 4s can't read for meaning, and 25% of homes don't even have any books. So how can we put free books in more children's hands? The ones whose parents can't afford to just walk into an exclusive books to buy Eric Hill's much-loved children's pop-up book, Where's Spot, which is priced at over 200 Rand. To discuss this, I'm joined by Kwanda Ndoda, Project Lead of Umngedi, Ongiziwe Ngokwana, Innovation Manager at DGMT, and Dorette Lowe, who is the Director of Programs and Operations at BookDash. Welcome, everyone.
Hello. Hi, everyone.
Hi, everyone.
I want to start this conversation by digging into research about the link between book ownership at a young age and better learning outcomes in school. Dorette, tell me about the link between being read to as a baby and early language and literacy development. What do studies tell us?
Yeah, Rahima, it's really interesting, and it's very important for us to understand that link. The organization I work for, BookDash, is member of a network of organizations called the Global Network of Early Years Book Gifting. And in June this year, we gathered for the first time in person in Brussels for a conference, and it was fascinating to hear from organizations as far afield as Korea, Peru, and many European countries where these programs have been running for a long time, what the impact is of this kind of universal access to books for families with babies. Often these books are handed out in hospitals, the day the baby is born, and the family is chatted to by a volunteer about the benefits of reading, and then, that they're kind of inducted into the world of literacy. But back to your question around the link between reading to a baby and early language and literacy development. What we know is that 90% of physical brain development happens in the first 3 years of a baby's life, when they form more than 1 million new neural connections per second. The critical ingredient supporting this growth and development is responsive, sensitive, and warm interactions between the children or the babies and the adults in their lives. The quality of these interactions shapes brain development, cognitive skills, and socio-emotional skills. This means that book sharing is most effective for the child, family, and society when adults start within the first few months of a child's life. But, of course, it remains effective at any age from birth to 6 and even older. So, reading books to babies and young children is sometimes referred to as the apparatus of happiness. At the Baby Dev Lab in East London in the UK, not East London in our Eastern Cape, they do neurological studies with caregivers and babies and young children to understand the neuroscience of reading better. What they found is that because reading is rhythmic and thinking also has a rhythm, what happens is that young children, when they are read to, their brain oscillations come into sync with the adult's brain oscillations, and they are in a shared state. This shared state is very calming for a young child, and it also helps them understand and learn better. And the connectedness is part of the experience, and the experience remains with us throughout our life. We know from other studies that children who receive nurturing care and responsive parenting in the first 1,000 and second 1,000 days have a better chance of reaching their developmental milestones. And books is a wonderful tool in this responsive caregiving.
Wow, that's fascinating. And it makes sense. Babies' brains are growing at an exponential rate, as you mentioned. They are sponges just absorbing information around them. And it's one of the reasons why children are able to pick up languages, multiple languages, easier than adults.
I'd just like to add to what Dorette has put forth, which I appreciate very much. I think it's always good to also take studies from the global north and give them South African context, because we have a lot of caregivers that obviously some of them don't have a culture of reading, so you have to kind of overcome that. Some of them are intimidated, I think, by books in general. So it's important to talk about a local study that happened, Ekayalicha, with caregivers, using wordless picture books, and book sharing is the name of that study. It was headed by Mark Tomlinson. So it's important there to know that there were the same outcomes that Dorette is talking about came out of that study, and it was using wordless picture books and book sharing, so just the sharing of stories in an animated way with a young child to achieve exactly the same outcomes.
Thanks, Kwanda. We also know that children with many books at home do better at school than children with no books at all, irrespective of their parents' level of education, their job or income, and that's according to research from 27 countries. The benefits extend into adulthood in terms of the skills they have and the jobs they get. Dorette, these findings tell us that owning books has long-term positive effects, especially for people living in poverty. But we are not realizing this potential in South Africa because 25% of households don't have any books at all.
Yes, so from the Reading Barometer, we know that 2/3 of homes with young children do not have a single picture book. There will be other books. There could be religious texts, there could be school texts, but not leisure reading books. And it's the storybooks that we know make the difference for young children because of this connectedness that can be sparked between the caregiver and the young child when there's a story being read or being told. So it's about the connectedness, not necessarily about turning the pages. So if there are books in the home, even if there are children's books, we also know that they are not always appropriate for our context. So they are sometimes just not very relevant to South African children. We know that they are not always age appropriate. And we also know that they're almost never in the child's home language. So that is what we know. We also know from Book Dash that often we are told that the only books that are in the children's homes are Book Dash books, and that's through our kind of, large volume bulk book distribution. But what we also see is that the international research findings are completely borne out by South African studies. So in the recent Thrive by 5 index, it was found that after controlling for child age and gender and ELP fees, which is an indication obviously of socioeconomic level, having access to books in the home showed a strong positive association with the total ELOM 4 and 5 score. As the number of books in the home increases, children's learning scores also go up. Children in homes with 10 or more books scored on average 6.6 points higher than those with no books, which is a meaningful and statistically significant difference.
Thanks, Dorette. So just for our listeners' benefit, the Thrive by 5 Index is a comprehensive survey of the development status of South Africa's preschoolers, and that was released in September of 2025. And ELOM is the Early Learning Outcomes Measurement, which basically tells you how children are developing in terms of their age. Kwanda, children with no books at home may be exposed to books at early learning programs, but nearly half of the early learning programs don't have age-appropriate books. What is the implication of this?
Well, as we said earlier, if you don't have a book which is the perfect manipulative to translate the nurturing and care framework for an attentive caregiver in the way that Dorette was describing earlier, then the deficit is already starting for that child. And the broader issue in South Africa's education system is that those that start on a deficit, that deficit actually just continues to grow with time and increases inequality within the education space. So I would say that is the biggest repercussion of that occurring. And the other problem is that as the child progresses through the education system, it becomes more and more difficult to catch them up and more expensive. So even on a fiscal basis, I mean, South Africa spends more on education per capita than many countries. So what happens is that we actually spend a lot of money trying to catch children up, which if we had books and resources and attentive caregiving earlier, we wouldn't have to spend that much on our education system, I think. Or alternatively, children would get more from the education system.
Also circling back to the Thrive by 5 conversation, the Thrive by 5 reports show that only 42% of 4-year-olds that are in early learning programs are on track. And there are a number of reasons for this, and reasons that have been mentioned in the conversation already. The fact that children in poor communities are less likely to have access to not only quality early learning, but also books in the home. And without proper quality early learning and access to books, it's hard to achieve the gains and outcomes that are required to close the gaps. What I've seen in terms of going into the ECD centers and grade R classrooms that we work with is sometimes the books are there, they're not contextually relevant, and they're sometimes just lying in the corner and not being adequately integrated in the classroom. There is the sense that the books are precious, that sometimes the children would damage the books or ruin them. And this comes into the way of creating or fostering that culture of reading. There's also the language issue. A lot of caregivers and parents aren't fluent in English, and the majority of texts and books that are available are sometimes available only in English. This creates some sort of shame in parents when they aren't able to participate in terms of book sharing and reading to their children, even if there are texts available. So it's also important in this conversation that the contextually relevant books that we give to children must also be in a wide variety of South African languages that demonstrate our rainbow nation. In the Thrive by 5 as well, it was also found that in terms of emergent literacy and language, it was one of the better domains in the report, but there was still a lot of inequalities that remained. The gender disparities between young girls and young boys, the fact that girls were scoring higher than boys, but also some of the socio-economic inequalities that continue to plague our communities around South Africa, where, as Dorette mentioned, children in higher fee schools performed better than children in lower fee schools. You also see the results of this being the fact that what's happening in the community will affect the ECD centers and the home. So if parents can barely have money to put food on the table and they're living below the poverty lines, it means that books won't be something that they prioritize, which means children in poorer communities continue to enter school without proper communication and comprehension skills. So that foundation isn't properly built.
Thanks, Ongi. Kwanda, you have something to add.
Yes, I just wanted to hop on Ongeziwe's point around language, which I 100% agree with. And I was just thinking, there's a huge gap when we communicate literacy, I think, to caregivers. Because if a caregiver has books at home and they're in English, granted those books are meant for children and they've got pictures, that parent can actually still share those stories with those children, ignoring the words and just sharing the stories using the pictures. How do we inculcate within society in general, especially the sector though, civil society when I say the sector, that in the formative years, in the years that Dorette was talking about in terms of brain development, so 0 to 5, education is 1/4 stimulation, but 3/4 encouragement. So, the way in which the stories or the books are used doesn't have to be the quote-unquote correct way, but it has to be encouraging serve and return between the caregiver and the child. That's the purpose of it. And so I think those books that are lying in the corner in that hypothetical classroom that you spoke about, Ongeziwe, maybe a way to get those books to be used is to start using that kind of language when we talk to teachers in the sector, so that even if books are in a different language, they can still be taken up and used.
Dorette, you have something to add?
Yes, thanks. I completely agree, Kwanda. I think a mistake that we make, and that perhaps we've been making for many decades, is to equate books in an early learning context with learning. we know that parents often think that reading is a school-based activity and it's not for the home, right? And I think it's because as a society we equate books with learning. But books when children are very young are not for learning. Books are for sharing. And the stimulation and the development that can be sparked through that sharing is what's important. Not the story, not decoding the text. It's not an educational activity per se just because there are words on the text. The educational value lies in the fact that an adult and a child are sharing this moment of pleasure. The child gets to explore their own thinking, the serve and return you spoke about, Kwanda, but also the child taking the lead and the adult following and the discussion being led by the child. All those things are of huge importance. And until we stop equating books with learning at, under 6, we're not going to fix it, because people are going to keep on thinking that it's like an educational tool, but it's not. It's a parenting tool. It's a love tool. It's everything that you need at that very early age for children.
Thanks for that, Dorette. Ongeziwe, I want to go back to you. You spoke about the Thrive by 5 index, and we know that children attending early learning programs had better developmental outcomes than those who were not in early learning programs. But we also know that children in wealthier communities did better. Books are expensive, Ongeziwe, and Dorette mentioned that it's not about just having books at the home, whether it be a Bible or any other book. It's about having picture books. And those are expensive, let's be honest. If you are not taking out books from your local library, you have to buy them. Considering the extent of poverty in this country, are we doing enough to make books available and accessible?
We aren't, Rahima. And as much as the local libraries are also available, libraries are also quiet spaces where children are expected to take a book and maybe sit in the corner and read. There's no bonding in the process with a caregiver. There's no assistance in terms of interpreting what the book means, what the pictures are, that engagement. And often there's no space for the learning through play-based kind of learning. So there is a need for us to rally around children being able to access books in the homes and in the ECD centers and in their community. But also then this means bright, good quality picture books that are age appropriate for the children. So not too much text, lots of pictures. They're able to identify things around their specific communities that are relevant to them and things that they know, which is why it is good that there are organizations that are doing this work, like Book Dash, to bridge the gap and to take books into the home and into the ECD centers and the communities.
Dorette, tell me about the program and how it operates.
The 3 things that we do at Book Dash is that we create our books, and our books are all engaging, open licensed African picture books. It's very innovative, and we've reimagined the publishing model so that our books are all created by volunteers, but these people are professional. So they're professional illustrators, designers, writers, and they come together for 12 hours and they create these fantastic stories that are really high quality. That saves us about 80% of the costs of a traditional publishing model, because no one is paid in the process, even though all the professional expertise is still together there. Editors, illustrators, designers, everyone, but no one gets paid. So then we translate those books, because it's incredibly important that the books are available in all the South African languages. We've recently started to also translate our books. Well, we're not doing it, but we have a partner, the Stellenbosch Hand Lab. They're translating our books into our 12th official language, which is South African Sign Language.
How does that work?
So the South African Sign Language versions of our books are, it's a film where a sign language signer tells the story through sign language, but the illustrations are still on the screen as well. So the deaf child would watch the film and see the illustrations, and the story is then read to them, because all our books are intended for children under 5, so they're intended for an adult to read it to a child. So in this case, it's the deaf storyteller signer who tells the story. So once we've translated our books, We then work with funding partners like DGMT and others to be able to print our books in very large volume. And then another innovation and a cost-saving mechanism is that we work with other organizations, we call them distribution partners, to do the last-mile distribution to children. But then there's also the interesting Nqedi project that we're working with DGMT on, and that is where we are sending directly to small individual ECDs. And for us, that's also very interesting because we like to be able to think that our books can reach the hardest to reach places.
Thanks, Dorette, for explaining that in detail. And it is quite an impressive operation. However, you won't be able to reach 7 million children. There needs to be a national initiative similar to the one I described in the beginning, Book Start in England. So, Kwanda, what will it take to get a book giveaway program going in this country?
The factors that would enable, I think, a conducive book giveaway type of project in South Africa is, first of all, political will, which we know in South Africa only comes mainly from local mobilization. So from people on the ground demanding something. We saw it with Fees Must Fall, and we see it in other contexts where, things really have to be at the brink because there's so much need in South Africa. So I think political will, the financing for it, which we know when working with Treasury, is that typically you have to have quite a lot of data to make a case for funds to be set aside for a specific project. And that's why the type of work that Dorette has done and other people have done actually across the sector, putting that together into a format that's acceptable by Treasury, is a way in which we could garner the support from Treasury.
If all of these enabling factors are in place, we might be able to get a book giveaway program going in South Africa. Would that be enough?
I think what would make it work, it's one step of it, right? You can get the book to the caregiver, but as we spoke about earlier, the book is really a quarter of it. It's a perfect manipulative. A manipulative is something you can use to stimulate a child. But the other 3/4 of the equation, I think, is encouraging the child. So understanding that it's not about correcting the child, because in fact, if anything, book sharing taught us that when you correct the child, especially curtly, it actually inhibits their curiosity and the sense that they must lead the book sharing between the caregiver and the child. And you want the child to take the lead.
So essentially you need caregivers to be made aware about their role in reading to children. Similar to what Dorette said in the beginning, that in some instances the books are handed to the caregivers in the hospital, and then there'll be a volunteer or someone from the program who explains the value of reading to the parents. I mean, what is your experience with Book Dash in getting caregivers to understand the value of reading?
Yeah, so we did a very interesting collaborative project with WordWorks and Nalibali in the Eastern Cape. It was a 5-year project, and it was called Yizani Sifunde, and it consisted of, I think, the perfect mix of support and resources. And the outcome of that project was incredibly encouraging on a child level. The children scored so much better on their ELOM scores than at baseline. And so there were many factors there, and I think it's the encouragement that Kwanda refers to. WordWorks trained the ECD practitioners on Little Stars, so there was really good early literacy work happening in the ECDs, right? Nalibali did the kind of extra school, out of school activations, encouragement, keeping the momentum going. And Book Dash put between 25 and 50 books into each household participating in this study. And what we found in the external evaluation was this very lovely virtuous cycle, almost called the nudge effect. And that was when children are exposed to very good reading practices at school, which they were, and they have books at home. They then go to their caregivers and they kind of enthusiastically demand that they are being read to, that books are shared with them. So whether that's a sibling, an older sibling, whether it's a caregiver, neighbor, it doesn't matter. But they are persistent and they nag. And then the caregiver reads to them. And then the caregivers have reported that they were very surprised by what they saw. They saw the children have ideas, they know the words, they can talk about what they are reading. They can say how the characters are feeling. So the caregivers felt this joy and pride effect in the young child that they didn't know before. They didn't know children, had these thoughts and feelings and like all these things. And that led to more reading. So it's a perfect mix really of having resources, getting the joy out of it, understanding how good that is for the child, because there were also parent interactions organized in this project, at the ECDs. So I think if there can be collaboration between the kind of ELP sector, the center-based ECD and the home-based ECD, then I think we've got, and you put books in there, then that's what we need.
Thank you for mentioning that project, because it's a good example of what civil society organizations have been doing and what they can do to promote early literacy and book sharing. That was Nalibali, WordWorks and Book Dash. Ongi, I want to round off this conversation. Let's start with you. What else can civil society organizations do to promote reading and book sharing in their communities?
So besides the collaboration piece that Dorette is speaking about, there are a lot of organizations and pocket of excellence across the country in terms of civil society organizations doing various things in terms of literacy and ECD. Some are doing, working with caregivers and training there. Some are providing the resources. Others reading and doing numeracy through play. And I think the one thing that would be important for a national agenda around this is learning from each other. So spaces where instead of trying to figure out something new, you're learning from the lessons of Book Dash, of Nalibali in terms of their distribution and their advocacy campaigns around reading, and you embed it into your ECD at home program with caregivers. We also need to realize that, reading isn't something that's going to happen just in schools. And for caregivers to be able to do this, they also need to be adequately supported, because the children who grow up not reading for meaning become the adults that are too shy to read to their kids or can't. So there needs to be focus around supporting these caregivers as well. But also at the ECD level, things like storytelling, oral storytelling, are very important. I know in isiXhosa, I grew up and we'd sit at home before bedtime and listen to stories from our older siblings, our parents, and these were called insomi, which translates to like folk tales. This is where our imagination started, being in context where you don't even dream about seeing Table Mountain or the beach, but you hear about it in these types of stories. So having families go back to those traditions that spark the love of reading is key, and then seeing how civil society organizations, funders can support programs around reading, oral storytelling, etc. is key.
And lastly, Dorette, as we close this conversation, you mentioned in describing how Book Dash operates, just the different people who've come together to volunteer their time pro bono, the designers, the authors. What message can we send to the private sector in general about assisting civil society in getting involved in making books more available and accessible to households that would benefit most from them?
At the beginning of Book Dash, the commercial publishers were very upset by what we were doing, because they were saying, you give away books for free, who's ever going to buy a book again? Until now, where they are some of our big supporters, because they see that what we're doing is we're getting books into places where there are no books, where no one can afford to buy books. So we're not in competition. We are in fact helping to hopefully create, a next generation of readers and book buyers, etc. So it's not about the long-term benefits for the economy and for society. Of course, there's that as well, but it's also about the children now, who are young now and who are living in difficult circumstances now, and where books can actually bring moments of pleasure and can really activate things that need to be activated in them at this young age. So I think our messaging should not just be encouraging towards caregivers, as Kwanda has said, like the 3/4 encouragement, but also to encourage the private sector to contribute to this very meaningful thing that can really help to transform a child's life. And well, that sounds grandiose, but it can change the trajectory. We know that.
Thank you so much to my guests. We've learned from this conversation that research shows that book ownership is a strong predictor of educational success, that it's good for society, and that it's, over the long term, good for the economy. By placing books into the hands of children, and by equipping ECD practitioners with the tools and encouragement to read to children, we can stimulate literacy development and a love of reading early in life. And now, over to you, those listening to this podcast. Using what you have heard today, you can try this reflective exercise. You'll need a pen and paper to write down these steps, or download the takeaway sheet from our website, dgmt.co.za, and go to the podcast tab. Write down the following questions and spend some time reflecting on them by yourself, and then share your reflections with your colleagues. Question number 1. For organizations that work with parents and caregivers, consider how you can build in messages that promote reading to young children. Question number 2. Think about ways in which you can use what you have at home or at your ECD center to promote a love for reading, even if you don't have any books. And question number 3. We know that there are strong arguments linking book ownership and books at home to economic growth, but I'd like you to think about the individual benefit, the benefit for the young child, as well as the social benefit of book ownership and why it's important, and share it with your colleagues. This is DGMT's Learning Lunch. Until next time.